Before I begin, I need to say something. What you're about to hear isn't easy for me. I never thought I would share this with anyone. But there was a moment, lost among the wilderness of northern Minnesota, when I understood that some stories need to be told, no matter how much it costs to relive them. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm 73 years old now. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 30 years, starting when I was 28, and foolish enough to think I could disappear from the world without consequences. I was wrong about many things back then, but I was right about one. Sometimes the world finds you anyway, especially when you're harboring something it doesn't understand. I moved to the Boundary Waters in 1972, after coming back from a war that left me hollow inside. The cabin I bought was more ruin than home. 40 acres of pine and birch, with a small lake that had no name on any map I ever found. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles south, and the nearest town was a dot called Ely, 26 miles of rough logging roads away. It was perfect for a man who wanted to forget he was human. The cabin sat on a small rise overlooking the water, built from logs that were already weathered gray when I arrived. Previous owner had died the winter before. Hypothermia, they said, though his family was eager enough to sell cheap and get out. I didn't ask questions. Questions were something I was trying to leave behind. Those first months were exactly what I needed. I spent my days chopping wood, repairing the roof, learning to live off what the land provided. I fished the lake at dawn, hunted deer when the season allowed, and planted a small garden that struggled against the short-growing season. Evenings were for reading by oil lamp and listening to the absolute silence that only comes when you're truly alone. Winter that first year nearly killed me. The cold was unlike anything I'd experienced, even in the mountains of Southeast Asia. It would drop to 30 below and stay there for weeks, turning the world into something crystalline and hostile. But I learned. I banked snow against the cabin walls for insulation, kept the fire going around the clock, and discovered that solitude in extreme cold becomes something almost spiritual. You either break or you find a deeper part of yourself. It was during that first winter that I heard the sounds. At first I thought it was wolves. The howling would start sometime after midnight, echoing across the frozen lake with a mournful quality that made my chest tighten. But wolves howl in patterns, in conversation with their pack. These sounds were different, longer, more complex, almost like language being stretched thin by sorrow. I told myself it was the wind, the ice settling, maybe a loon that had stayed too late in the season. But in the deepest part of me, I knew I was hearing something else entirely. The sounds continued all winter, becoming part of my routine, like the crackling of the fire or the whistle of wind through the eaves. Sometimes I would step outside into the bitter air, my breath crystallizing instantly, and listen to those haunting calls across the ice. They made me feel less alone, though I couldn't explain why. Spring came late that year, not arriving until well into April. As the ice began to break up with sounds like gunshots echoing through the forest, the nocturnal calls grew less frequent. By the time the last snow melted, they had stopped altogether. I found myself missing them more than I cared to admit. That summer, I began exploring deeper into the wilderness around my cabin. There were old hunting trails, some marked only by subtle breaks in the underbrush, or the occasional blaze cut into a tree decades before. Following these paths, I discovered hidden lakes, beaver meadows, and stands of old-growth pine that felt like natural cathedrals. It was on one of these explorations, maybe 3 miles northwest of my cabin, that I found the bones. They were scattered in a small clearing, bleached white by sun and weather. At first glance they looked like deer bones. The size was about right, but as I knelt down for a closer look, I realized these bones were wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. They were too long in some places, too thick in others. The skull, half hidden under fallen leaves, was elongated and sharp with teeth that belonged in nightmares. I should have left them there, should have walked away and never come back to that clearing, but something about those bones called to me, the way the winter howls had called to me. I spent the afternoon carefully gathering them, wrapping them in my jacket and carrying them home. That night I laid the bones out on my kitchen table and tried to make sense of what I was looking at. By oil lamp light, they seemed even more impossible. The creature they had belonged to would have stood maybe 6 feet tall, but built all wrong, too thin, too angular, with arms that would have hung almost to its knees. The skull was the most disturbing part, elongated like a wolf's but larger, with eye sockets that were too big and teeth that were clearly designed for rending flesh. I wrapped the bones back up and stored them in a trunk under my bed. But I couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't stop wondering what kind of creature had called this wilderness home. More disturbing still was the nagging certainty that these bones were connected to the winter sounds I'd been hearing. Summer passed, peacefully enough. I fell into a routine of maintenance and exploration, gradually extending my knowledge of the surrounding wilderness. I learned which streams held brook trout, where the best wild berries grew, and how to read the subtle signs that told me when bears or wolves had passed nearby. The isolation that had felt oppressive in winter became a source of strength in the long summer days. But as autumn approached and the first frost touched the edges of the lake, I began to feel watched. It started as just a feeling, that prickle at the back of your neck that tells you eyes are upon you. I would be splitting wood or checking my fish traps, and suddenly I'd be compelled to look over my shoulder. But there was never anything there, just the forest standing silent and still. The feeling grew stronger as the days shortened. Sometimes, while working outside, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there would be nothing but shadow and branches. Once, while gutting a fish at the edge of the lake, I heard a stick break in the forest behind me. When I spun around, hand moving instinctively toward the knife at my belt, I saw something large slip between 2 pine trees about 50 yards away, but it moved wrong, not like a bear or a moose, but with a fluid grace that seemed almost human. I began keeping my rifle closer, though I wasn't sure what I would do if I actually encountered whatever was watching me. The bones under my bed seemed to pulse with significance, as if they were connected to this presence that had begun to haunt my daily life. October came with an early snowfall that painted the world in crystalline silence. It was on a morning after this first snow that I saw the tracks. I had stepped outside to check on a noise that had woken me before dawn. Probably just a branch falling, I told myself. But there in the fresh snow were footprints leading from the forest to within 20 feet of my cabin, then back into the trees. They were large, much larger than my own, and shaped wrong. The prints showed what looked like elongated feet, with toes that ended in claws. But the most disturbing thing about them was the spacing. Whatever had made these tracks had been walking upright, with a stride longer than any human's. I followed the tracks into the forest, my rifle in my hands and my heart hammering against my ribs. The trail led northwest, toward the clearing where I had found the bones. But before I reached that familiar spot, the tracks simply ended at the edge of a steep ravine. Whatever had made them had either jumped across a 15-foot gap or simply vanished. I stood there in the snow, looking down into the shadows at the bottom of the ravine, and felt a certainty settle into my bones, like winter cold. I was sharing this wilderness with something that shouldn't exist, something that the bones under my bed had once belonged to, and it knew where I lived. That night, I moved the bones from under my bed to my kitchen table. I lit every oil lamp I had and studied them again, trying to understand what I was dealing with. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that these remains belonged to something that was neither fully animal nor fully human. The bone structure suggested something that could move on either 2 legs or 4, something built for both speed and stealth, The teeth spoke of a predator that could tear through hide and bone with ease, but there was something else about the bones, something that had escaped my notice before. Along the edges of several ribs and on the inside of the skull, there were fine scratches that looked almost like writing, not letters or symbols that I recognized, but deliberate markings nonetheless. Someone or something had carved these bones after death, turning them into a kind of record or memorial. I was still studying these markings when I heard a soft scraping sound outside my cabin. My blood turned to ice water. The sound came again, a deliberate scratching against the log walls, starting near the door and moving slowly toward the window beside my table. I reached for my rifle with hands that shook more than I wanted to admit. The scratching stopped directly outside the window. For a long moment, there was complete silence except for the hammering of my heart. Then, slowly, a shadow fell across the oil lamplight, filtering through the glass. I forced myself to look up from the bones scattered across my table. There, framed in my window, was a face that belonged in the deepest nightmares of humanity. It was gaunt beyond imagining, with skin stretched tight over angular bones that jutted and curved in ways that hurt to look at. The eyes were large and dark, reflecting the lamplight like black water. The mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. But despite its alien features, there was something unmistakably intelligent in its gaze. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but meet those dark eyes and feel the weight of the intelligence that was vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. Then the creature raised one elongated hand and pressed it against the glass. Its fingers were impossibly long, ending in claws that could have easily shredded flesh. But the gesture itself was gentle, almost questioning. It wasn't trying to break in or threaten me. It was trying to communicate. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I set down my rifle and approached the window. The creature's eyes followed my movement, but it didn't pull away. When I was close enough to see my own reflection in its dark gaze, I raised my hand and pressed it against the glass opposite its palm. The cold coming through the window was intense, but I held my hand there. We stayed like that for perhaps a minute, two beings separated by a thin sheet of glass and an impossible gulf of species. Then the creature slowly pulled its hand away and stepped back into the shadows. I caught a glimpse of its full form, tall and impossibly thin, moving with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrible, before it melted back into the forest. I spent the rest of the night sitting at my table, staring at the bones and trying to process what had just happened. Every rational part of my mind told me I had just encountered something that couldn't exist, something that belonged in legends and campfire stories. But I had seen it, had looked into its eyes, had felt some kind of connection pass between us. As dawn broke over the lake, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of gold and pink, I made a decision that would define the next 30 years of my life. Instead of packing up and fleeing back to civilization, I was going to stay. I was going to try to understand what I had encountered, and if possible, I was going to try to communicate with it. The bones on my table seemed to approve of this decision, though I couldn't have explained why I felt that way. All I knew was that my life of solitude had just become something far more complex and dangerous. But also, for the first time since returning from the war, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. That morning, I gathered up the bones and carried them back to the clearing where I had found them. But instead of scattering them randomly as they had been before, I arranged them carefully in an anatomical pattern, laying out the complete skeleton of the impossible creature. It took me hours to get the positioning right, working from my limited knowledge of anatomy and a strange intuitive sense of how the bones should fit together. When I was finished, I stepped back to survey my work. The skeleton looked even more alien assembled than it had in pieces. clearly representing something that had never walked the earth in normal evolutionary history. But there was also something beautiful about it, something that spoke of adaptation to conditions I couldn't imagine. I left the bones there and walked home, feeling like I had completed some kind of ritual I didn't fully understand. That night, the familiar howling returned for the first time since winter had ended, but now, knowing what was making those sounds, they didn't seem mournful anymore. They sounded like a form of recognition, perhaps even gratitude. Over the following weeks, I established a routine that seemed to acknowledge the presence watching me from the forest. Each morning, I would leave small offerings at the edge of the clearing, fish from my traps, berries I had gathered, sometimes just a cup of fresh water from the spring behind my cabin. The offerings were always gone when I returned the next day, though I never saw what took them. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of my watcher during these daily trips, a shadow moving between trees, a flash of pale skin in the dappled sunlight, occasionally the gleam of those dark eyes watching me from the underbrush. But the creature never approached me directly again, seeming content to observe from a distance. Winter returned with unusual severity that year, bringing temperatures that dropped below -40 and snow that piled higher than my windows. I had learned from my previous winter and was better prepared, with a full cord of seasoned wood and enough preserved food to last until spring. But the isolation was more intense than before, broken now by the knowledge that something impossible was sharing the wilderness with me. The howling resumed as soon as the lake froze solid, but now it had a different quality. Sometimes it sounded like mourning, as I had originally thought, but other times it carried notes that could only be described as song, complex melodies that rose and fell with mathematical precision, as if they were following some pattern beyond my understanding. On the longest night of winter, something extraordinary happened. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day spent digging out after a particularly heavy snowfall. But sometime in the deepest part of the night, I was awakened by a sound unlike any I had heard before. It wasn't the usual howling, but something softer, almost like humming. The sound was coming from just outside my cabin. I slipped from bed and crept to the window, peering out through the frost that had formed on the glass. There, standing in the snow between my cabin and the lake, was my mysterious neighbor. But it wasn't alone. Arranged in a circle around the creature were what I first took to be standing stones, dark shapes rising from the snow like ancient monuments. But as my eyes adjusted to the starlight, I realized these weren't stones at all. They were bones, huge bones, far larger than those I had found and arranged in the clearing. These looked like they had belonged to creatures the size of bears or larger, but with the same wrong proportions that marked them as something other than any natural animal. The creature stood in the center of this bone circle, its arms raised toward the star-filled sky, producing that haunting humming sound. As I watched, the sound grew more complex, becoming a multi-tonal melody that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. Other voices joined in, distant howls from across the lake and deeper in the forest, as if the entire wilderness was participating in some ancient ceremony. I found myself opening my window despite the brutal cold, needing to hear the music more clearly. The creature's head turned toward me, and even across the distance, I could feel its dark gaze. But it didn't stop its singing. Instead, it seemed to sing louder, as if inviting me to witness something sacred. The ceremony continued for perhaps an hour, the complex harmonies rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. When it finally ended, the sudden silence was so complete it felt oppressive. The creature gathered up the large bones with careful reverence, arranging them in what looked like a burial cairn at the edge of the forest. Then it turned toward my cabin once more, inclined its elongated head in what could only be a bow, and melted back into the shadows. I spent the rest of that night sitting by my window, trying to process what I had witnessed. It had clearly been some kind of ritual, perhaps a memorial for others of its kind who had died in this wilderness. The inclusion of my presence suggested that the creature had come to see me as part of its world, someone worthy of witnessing its most sacred moments. From that night forward, my relationship with the forest changed completely. I no longer felt like an intruder who was being tolerated. I felt like I had been accepted into something ancient and profound, something that connected me to the land in ways I had never imagined possible. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came new patterns of interaction with my impossible neighbor. Instead of just leaving offerings at the clearing, I began to find gifts waiting for me near my cabin. Unusual stones with holes worn through them by water, pieces of wood carved into shapes that suggested meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Sometimes the skulls of small animals arranged with what looked like deliberate artistry. The creature itself became less secretive, allowing me to observe it more directly. I learned that it moved through the forest with an efficiency that spoke of perfect adaptation to its environment. It could climb trees with spider-like agility, moving through the canopy without disturbing so much as a leaf. On the ground, it could become virtually invisible, blending with shadows and undergrowth until it seemed to disappear entirely. But what impressed me most was its intelligence. I began leaving simple puzzles near the bone clearing, arrangements of stones or sticks that required problem-solving to disassemble. These were always solved by the next day, often rearranged into new patterns that suggested the creature had not only understood the puzzle, but had improved upon it. More intriguingly, it began to leave puzzles for me. I would find arrangements of objects that clearly required some kind of response, sequences of stones that needed to be completed, or patterns of scratches in the dirt that looked like they were asking questions. I wasn't always successful in solving these challenges, but the attempt to communicate across such a vast species barrier became one of the most rewarding aspects of my increasingly unusual life. It was during this second summer that I first heard the creature attempt to speak. I had been fishing from my usual spot on the lake shore, enjoying the peaceful repetition of casting and retrieval. The water was mirror calm, reflecting the pine-covered hills that surrounded us like a green bowl. I was so absorbed in the rhythm of fishing that I almost missed the soft sound that came from the forest behind me. Mas. My name, spoken in a voice like wind through dry leaves. I turned slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever spell had allowed this moment to occur. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, perhaps 20 feet away, its dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Thomas," it said again, more clearly this time, though the voice still had an otherworldly quality that raised the hair on my arms. I set down my fishing rod carefully and turned to face the creature fully. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "That's my name." The creature tilted its elongated head, studying me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as curiosity. "Thomas," it repeated, then made a series of sounds in its throat that might have been an attempt to say something else, but whatever language it was trying to speak was beyond my understanding. Instead, it pointed to itself with one clawed finger and made a sound that was part whistle, part growl. I listened carefully, trying to memorize the complex combination of tones. When it repeated the sound, I attempted to reproduce it, though my human vocal cords could only approximate what I had heard. The creature's reaction was unmistakable, what could only be described as delight. Its mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing those sharp teeth, but in an expression that somehow conveyed pleasure rather than threat. It repeated its name sound several more times, patiently correcting my pronunciation until I could produce something that seemed acceptable. From that day forward, our communication began to develop rapidly. The creature, whose name I eventually learned to pronounce as something like Yo Juan, though it involved harmonic overtones my throat couldn't quite manage, proved to be remarkably adept at learning human speech. Within weeks, it had mastered perhaps a dozen English words, though it spoke them with an accent that belonged to no earthly culture. More importantly, it began to teach me its own language. This was unlike any human tongue, incorporating not just sounds, but also gestures, body positions, and even what seemed to be olfactory components I couldn't detect, but which clearly carried meaning. Learning it required me to think about communication in entirely new ways, to consider how intelligence might express itself without the limitations of human physiology. Our daily interactions became elaborate conversations, mixing broken English with the creature's complex native tongue and a growing vocabulary of shared gestures and expressions. I learned that Yohuan was far older than I had imagined, old enough to remember when this wilderness had been different, when others of its kind had moved through these forests in numbers that suggested an entire hidden civilization. It was through these conversations that I began to understand the true tragedy of what I was witnessing. Yohuan was not just an individual creature living in isolation. It was the last of its kind, the sole survivor of a species that had once thrived in the deep places of the North American continent. Disease, climate change, and the encroachment of human civilization had slowly eroded their population until only Yohuan remained, keeping the old traditions alive through sheer force of will. The bones I had found in the clearing belonged to Yohuan's mate, dead now for more than 20 years. The winter ceremonies I had witnessed were memorial services, ways of honoring not just the immediate dead, but the entire lost culture that Yohuan carried alone. The gifts it brought me, the puzzles we shared, the patient teaching of language. All of these were acts of desperate hope, attempts to preserve something of its people's knowledge before death claimed the final repository of their wisdom. Understanding this filled me with a sorrow deeper than anything I had experienced, even in the war. But it also filled me with a sense of purpose that transformed my exile from a retreat into a calling. I was not just Thomas Mitchell anymore, isolated veteran trying to forget the world. I was the keeper of secrets, the student of a master whose knowledge would die with it unless I could find some way to preserve what I was learning. I began keeping detailed journals, documenting every aspect of my interactions with Yohuan. I learned about plant medicines that could heal wounds faster than anything in conventional pharmacy, about reading weather patterns with an accuracy that put meteorology to shame, about moving through wilderness without leaving tracks or disturbing the natural balance of the ecosystem. But more than practical knowledge, I was learning about an entirely different way of understanding the world. Yohuan's people had developed philosophies of existence that were simultaneously more complex and more simple than human thought. They saw the forest as a single vast organism, every tree and stream and animal contributing to a living entity that was greater than the sum of its parts. Individual identity was less important than harmony with this larger system, and death was simply a transformation from one kind of participation to another. These concepts challenged everything I thought I knew about life and consciousness. My own species seemed suddenly crude and disconnected, stumbling through existence without understanding our place in the larger web of being that surrounded us. Human civilization, with its emphasis on domination and consumption, appeared to be a kind of cancer spreading across the face of a living planet. As years passed, my life became a delicate balance between two worlds. During the warmer months, I would spend days at a time with Yohuan, learning everything it could teach me about its people's way of life. We would travel together to places deep in the wilderness that no human had ever seen. Hidden valleys where ancient trees grew in patterns that had been carefully cultivated by Yowan's ancestors, underground caverns decorated with artwork that told the history of a lost civilization, sacred sites where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed thin enough to step across. But as human encroachment on the wilderness gradually increased, I also had to serve as Yowan's protection from discovery. Hunting parties occasionally penetrated deep enough into our territory to pose a threat. Government surveyors began mapping areas that had been left alone for decades. Once, a team of wildlife biologists established a temporary research station less than 5 miles from my cabin, forcing Yowan to retreat so far into the deep wilderness that I didn't see it for 3 months. Each of these intrusions reminded me how precarious our situation was. The world was changing around us, becoming smaller and more connected. Satellite imagery could now penetrate places that had been hidden for centuries. Radio communications allowed people to call for help from the deepest wilderness. It was becoming harder and harder to maintain the secrecy that protected both of us from a civilization that would never understand what we had found together. The crisis came in the spring of 1998, 26 years after I had first heard Yowan's voice echoing across the winter lake. I had noticed increased air traffic over our area, helicopters and small planes flying search patterns that suggested official interest in our remote corner of the wilderness. At first, I assumed it was related to a missing hiker or perhaps a drug interdiction operation. But the flights continued for weeks, becoming more frequent and more systematic. Then, early one morning, while I was checking my fish traps at the lake's edge, I spotted something that made my blood turn cold. A figure in military fatigues was moving through the forest on the far side of the lake, carrying what looked like sophisticated surveillance equipment. Even at a distance, I could see that this person was not a casual hiker or researcher. The way they moved, the gear they carried, the careful methodology of their search. It all spoke of a government operation with serious backing and specific objectives. I spent the day watching from concealment as more personnel deployed around the lake. They were setting up a perimeter, establishing observation posts, preparing for something that required both secrecy and significant resources. By evening, I had counted at least 12 individuals, all carrying military-grade equipment and communicating through encrypted radio systems. That night, Yowan approached my cabin with unusual urgency. Its manner was agitated, almost frantic, in a way I had never seen before. Through our shared language, it communicated that it had detected the presence of many humans in the forest, humans who moved with purpose and carried unfamiliar technologies. More disturbing, it had found evidence that these intruders had been present for longer than I realized. Hidden monitoring devices, carefully concealed observation posts, signs that our activities had been under surveillance for possibly months. We had been discovered. The next morning brought confirmation of our worst fears. As dawn light filtered through the forest, the sound of approaching helicopters grew from a distant whisper to a thunderous roar. I watched from my window as military aircraft surrounded my cabin, disgorging teams of armed personnel who moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation. A loudspeaker crackled to life. "Thomas Mitchell, you are required to exit your residence immediately for questioning regarding unauthorized contact with an unidentified biological entity. This is a matter of national security. Compliance is mandatory." I looked toward the forest where Yowan had disappeared the night before, knowing that this was probably the last time I would see my home or my extraordinary friend. Whatever was about to happen would change everything, and not for the better. With hands that shook only slightly, I opened my cabin door and stepped out to face whatever consequences came from 30 years of keeping the impossible secret that had given my life meaning. The agents who took me into custody were professional and efficient, but not unkind. They identified themselves as members of a joint task force involving multiple government agencies, Fish and Wildlife, FBI, CDC, and several others whose acronyms I didn't recognize. Their questions were detailed and specific, demonstrating knowledge of my activities that was both impressive and terrifying. They knew about my daily trips to the bone clearing. They had photographs of me leaving offerings at the forest's edge. They had audio recordings of the winter ceremonies, somehow captured with equipment sophisticated enough to detect sounds across vast distances. Most unsettling of all, they had grainy video footage of Yowan itself, taken with telephoto lenses from observation posts I had never suspected existed. "Mr. Mitchell," said the lead investigator, a thin woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing, "we're not here to prosecute you for any wrongdoing. Our primary concern is the containment and study of the entity you've been in contact with. We understand that you've developed what might be called a relationship with this creature. We need your cooperation to ensure that both you and it can be kept safe." I remained silent during hours of questioning, refusing to provide any information about Yowan's capabilities, behaviors, or whereabouts. I could see the frustration building in my interrogators, but I also sensed that they were operating under constraints that prevented them from using more aggressive tactics. Whatever agency was ultimately in charge of this operation wanted Yowan captured alive and intact, which gave me the only leverage I was likely to have. On the second day of my detention, they showed me satellite images of the forest around my cabin. The pictures revealed details I could never have detected from ground level: paths worn by Yowan's movements over decades, areas where the vegetation grew in unnatural patterns, even what looked like deliberately constructed shelters hidden deep in the wilderness canopy. "This entity has been modifying its environment for years," the investigator explained. "These modifications suggest intelligence levels that far exceed anything in known taxonomy. We need to understand what we're dealing with, Mr. Mitchell, for the safety of everyone involved." But I could see past their scientific rhetoric to the fear that motivated this operation. They were afraid of Yowan not because it posed any immediate threat, but because it represented something that challenged their understanding of what was possible in the natural world. A species that had evolved alongside humans without being detected, that had developed intelligence and culture and perhaps even technology while remaining completely hidden from scientific observation. The implications were staggering. If one impossible creature could remain undiscovered for so long, what else might be sharing the planet with us? How much of what we considered settled science was actually ignorance masquerading as knowledge? The existence of Yowan suggested that human understanding of the world was far more limited than anyone wanted to admit. On the third day, everything changed. I was being interviewed by a new team of specialists when alarms began sounding throughout the temporary facility they had established near my cabin. Through the window, I could see personnel running toward the forest, carrying tranquilizer equipment and what looked like specialized capture devices. They had found Yowan. What followed was chaos that lasted for hours. Radio chatter filled with urgent communications about a mobile target that was evading containment protocols with unprecedented agility and intelligence. I could hear helicopter rotors spinning up, vehicles racing through the forest, and occasionally, in the distance, a sound that made my heart clench with grief: Yowan's voice, not singing now but crying out in distress and confusion. By evening, the sounds of pursuit had faded into an ominous silence. When my interrogator returned to the interview room, her expression was grim in a way that told me everything I needed to know before she spoke. "The entity has been contained," she said carefully. "It will be transferred to a secure facility for study. Your cooperation in this matter will determine whether you face federal charges for harboring an unclassified biological entity, or whether you can be considered a cooperating witness in a matter of national importance. I felt something break inside my chest, a pain sharper than anything I had experienced in war or solitude. Yowan was gone, captured and caged like a laboratory animal, and I had been powerless to prevent it. Worse, my mere presence in the wilderness had ultimately led to its discovery. In trying to preserve the last member of an extraordinary species, I had become the instrument of its final destruction. The facility where they took me for debriefing was unlike any government installation I had ever heard of. Located somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, it was built into the living rock of a mountainside, hidden so completely that it was invisible from more than 100 yards away. Inside, the corridors and laboratories hummed with activity that seemed focused on studying things that officially didn't exist. I was assigned to a team of researchers whose job was to extract every piece of information I possessed about Yowan and its capabilities. They were professional and even respectful, but their questions revealed assumptions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness that made me understand how impossible it would be for them to truly comprehend what they had captured. To them, Yowan was a specimen, a biological puzzle to be solved through observation and experimentation. They could measure its physical capabilities, analyze its vocalizations, even attempt to decode the neurological basis of its intelligence. But they could never understand what I had learned during 30 years of patient communication, that Yowan's people had developed ways of thinking about existence that were fundamentally different from human cognition. The researcher leading my debriefing was a neurobiologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, whose enthusiasm for her work was both admirable and heartbreaking. She showed me brain scans of Yowan that revealed neural structures unlike anything in known biology, networks of connectivity that suggested information processing capabilities far beyond normal animal cognition. "The implications are extraordinary," she explained, pointing to highlighted areas on the scan. "This creature's brain shows characteristics that we've theorized might exist in truly advanced intelligence, but never actually observed. If we can understand how these neural networks function, we might learn things about consciousness itself that could revolutionize our understanding of cognition." It beamed, but when I tried to explain that Yowan's intelligence was not just a matter of neural complexity, that it was connected to a spiritual understanding of the world that could not be measured in any laboratory, Dr. Chen's expression became pitying. To her, my claims about Yowan's philosophical insights were simply anthropomorphization, the natural human tendency to project meaning onto animal behavior that was complex but not truly conscious. I spent 3 months in that facility, sharing everything I could remember about my years with Yowan while fighting a growing sense of despair. The researchers were learning things, certainly. They documented Yowan's ability to heal from injuries at rates that suggested completely unknown biological processes. They recorded vocalizations that demonstrated acoustic capabilities no known animal possessed. They observed problem-solving behaviors that challenged every existing model of animal intelligence, but they could not understand what they had truly captured. Yowan was dying in their care, not from physical mistreatment, but from spiritual isolation. The last keeper of an entire civilization's wisdom was slowly fading away in a sterile environment that could quantify everything about its existence except what made that existence meaningful. I tried to convince Dr. Chen and her team to allow me regular contact with Yowan, arguing that the stress of complete isolation from familiar interaction was affecting its health and possibly compromising their research. But security protocols prevented any unsupervised contact, and supervised visits were limited to brief sessions where every word was recorded and analyzed. During these visits, I could see the light fading from Yowan's dark eyes. It spoke to me in our shared language, telling me about dreams where it ran through endless forests with others of its kind, about memories of ceremonies that had once celebrated the turning of seasons and the continuity of life. But increasingly, those conversations became farewells, attempts to pass on final pieces of knowledge before the weight of captivity crushed its spirit entirely. "The winter songs," Yowan whispered during our last conversation, its voice barely audible even in the absolute silence of the containment chamber. "Remember the winter songs, Thomas. When the world becomes too small for wonder, remember the songs that call to the wild places still hidden in human hearts." 3 days later, Yowan died in its cell, despite the frantic efforts of a medical team that understood the biology of its body, but not the nature of its soul. The official cause of death was listed as systemic organ failure of unknown etiology. But I knew that Yowan had simply chosen to stop living in a world that could capture its body, but not honor its spirit. The last of its kind had died as alone as it had lived, surrounded by observers who could measure everything except what mattered most. After Yowan's death, my own situation changed rapidly. The research project was quietly shut down, its findings classified at levels that ensured they would never see public disclosure. I was debriefed one final time, signed documents that bound me to secrecy under threat of federal prosecution, and was released back into a world that had no place for the knowledge I had gained. They offered me a pension, a comfortable retirement, even psychological counseling to help me process the unusual experiences I had endured. But what they could not offer was any acknowledgement that something precious and irreplaceable had been lost, or any recognition that their actions had contributed to what amounted to a form of genocide, the extinction of the final member of a species whose wisdom might have changed how humanity understood its place in the world. I returned to Minnesota, but not to my old cabin. That area had been declared a restricted research zone, closed to public access indefinitely. Instead, I found a small house on the outskirts of Duluth, close enough to the wilderness to remember what I had lost, far enough from it to avoid the constant ache of memories too painful to bear. For 20 years, I have kept the secret they demanded I keep. I have watched as climate change and habitat destruction continue to erode the wild places where creatures like Yowan once lived in hidden harmony. I have seen the acceleration of a technological civilization that measures progress by its ability to illuminate and control every corner of the natural world. But I have also kept alive the knowledge that Yowan shared with me, the understanding that consciousness and intelligence can take forms that human science has never imagined. In my dreams, I still hear the winter songs echoing across frozen lakes, still see dark eyes that reflected depths of wisdom accumulated over millennia of careful observation and patient thought. Sometimes, usually in the deep hours of winter nights, I wonder if I made the right choice in staying silent for so long. Perhaps if I had spoken out immediately after Yowan's death, the public outcry might have prevented future operations like the one that captured it. Perhaps the knowledge it shared with me could have contributed something valuable to humanity's understanding of itself and its relationship with the natural world. But I also remember the way those researchers looked at Yowan, not as a being worthy of respect and protection, but as a problem to be solved, a resource to be exploited. And I understand that speaking out would likely have accomplished nothing except to expose me to ridicule or worse. The world is not ready for the knowledge that creatures like Yowan exist, much less for the humbling recognition that such creatures might have wisdom that exceeds our own. Yet now, as I feel the weight of my own mortality settling into my bones, I find I cannot carry these secrets to my grave. The story needs to be told, if only to bear witness to what was lost when Yowan died in that sterile cell. There are mysteries still hidden in the wild places of the world, forms of intelligence and consciousness that have learned to avoid human contact precisely because they understand what discovery would mean. I tell this story not to expose these hidden beings to the same fate that claimed Yowan, but to plant seeds of possibility in human minds that might someday be ready to approach such discoveries with wisdom rather than conquest. Perhaps future generations will learn to see the natural world not as a collection of resources to be catalogued and exploited, but as a community of consciousness in which humanity is only one voice among many. The winter songs that Yowan taught me still echo in my memory, complex harmonies that speak of relationships between living beings that extend far beyond the simplistic models of predator and prey, competition and survival. They sing of a world where every creature has its place and purpose, where intelligence serves not domination, but integration, where the greatest achievement is not the accumulation of power, but the cultivation of understanding. I am 73 years old now, and I feel the approach of my own winter. But I carry with me the memory of dark eyes that reflected starlight across frozen lakes, of a voice that could speak the names of things that exist beyond human language, of a presence that transformed my exile from a retreat into a pilgrimage toward forms of knowledge that our species has barely begun to imagine. When I die, that memory will die with me, but perhaps this story will survive, a testament to the possibility that consciousness and wonder exist in forms we have never thought to look for, in places we have never learned to see. And perhaps, somewhere in the remaining wild places of the world, other voices are still singing the winter songs, waiting for humanity to develop ears capable of hearing the music that connects all living things. The secret I have carried for so long is not really about one extraordinary creature living hidden in the Minnesota wilderness. It is about the recognition that the world is far stranger, far more alive, far more conscious than we have ever dared to admit. And that recognition, more than any technological achievement or scientific discovery, might be the key to humanity's survival in a universe that is far more intelligent and far more interconnected than we have ever imagined. I think about Yowan every day, about the wisdom that died with it in that underground facility. But I also think about the possibility that others of its kind might still survive in the deep places of the world, keeping alive the knowledge that could teach humanity how to live as part of the web of consciousness, rather than as its self-appointed master. This is my testimony, my witness to 30 years of impossible friendship with a being that showed me what intelligence could become when it served integration rather than domination. It is my gift to a world that desperately needs to remember what it means to be part of something larger than itself, something that deserves not conquest, but communion. The winter songs are still being sung if we have the courage to listen. The wild places still hold mysteries if we have the wisdom to approach them with respect rather than exploitation. And consciousness still flourishes in forms we have never imagined, if we have the humility to recognize that intelligence might wear faces we have never learned to see. This is what Yowan taught me. This is what I carry forward into whatever time remains. This is what I offer to a world that stands at the edge of its own winter, hoping that somewhere in the songs, still echoing from the wild places, we might find the harmonies that could teach us how to live.